When I turned 16 last week, my parents kicked me out to make room for my sister's new baby. It was a shocking twist to a day that felt more like an afterthought than a celebration. I, 16F, had barely received a birthday greeting before being told to pack my things and move to my aunt's house. My parents, it seemed, were more invested in my older sister Amanda, 22F, who's been the golden child for as long as I can remember. With her 7-month pregnancy, they decided that I had to vacate my room so the baby could have a proper nursery. To be honest, I've never expected much from my parents. They've always given me the bare minimum, but this was a new low. I didn't even entertain the idea that they might be joking. They were dead serious. After they laid out their plan, silence hung between us. They assured me they'd cover my expenses until I turned 18 and promised I'd be looked after, but it felt like a hollow consolation. I didn't want to argue, but I couldn't help but ask why they couldn't use the guest room for the nursery. After a moment of hesitation, they revealed it was occupied by Amanda's boyfriend. So, in short, my parents had their own room, Amanda and her boyfriend had theirs, and the baby would get a third. I noticed Amanda wasn't home, probably on purpose, so she wouldn't have to witness this disgraceful decision and feel guilty about it. Although Amanda and I had never been close due to our age difference, I had assumed she would at least care enough to oppose this arrangement. But now, I began to question if I really knew her at all. Disappointment washed over me, especially on what should have been my special day, but I held my tongue and reluctantly agreed to leave. By this point, I had come to accept that my parents would never truly love me, so I went upstairs and started packing. They helped, though I could sense their urgency was more about getting rid of me than about my well-being. Once everything was ready, they drove me to my aunt's house, chatting happily during the ride while I stared out the window in silence. When we arrived, they dropped me off at the door without so much as a hug or a goodbye. My aunt welcomed me warmly. Unlike my parents, she actually seemed to enjoy my presence. After settling in, I confided in her about my disappointment with my parents. She looked taken aback and asked me to repeat what I had just said. As I recounted the morning's events, her expression shifted from a smile to a frown. Without saying a word, she grabbed her phone and retreated to another room to make a call. I could hear her voice rising in frustration, which was unusual for her, given her typically calm demeanor. When she returned, she was visibly upset. I learned that my father had misled her, claiming I had suggested moving in with her to help accommodate the baby. He painted it as a positive arrangement, which had influenced my aunt's decision to take me in. She had assumed I was unhappy at home and wanted a change, but now that she knew the truth, she was furious. She had every right to be. My parents had lied to her about something so important. The gravity of what they'd done hit me hard. I had always known my sister was their favorite, but this was beyond what I could have imagined. They had even chosen to give up their guest room for Amanda's boyfriend, a man in his 20s who had his own apartment, while pushing me aside. If they truly cared, they could have made arrangements for Amanda to stay with him, but they chose to keep her close and sacrifice my comfort in the process. Feeling a mix of hurt and betrayal, I decided to take action. I didn't know how my aunt would react, so I waited until she stepped out for a nap. Then I took out my phone and poured my heart into a post online, detailing not only that day's events but also years of feeling like a second-class citizen in my own home. As I typed, emotions overwhelmed me, and by the time I hit post, tears streamed down my face. I turned off my phone, fearing the fallout of my actions. An hour later, my aunt returned, and I could see the calmness in her eyes had shifted. She asked if I had posted something, and I nodded, sensing the gravity of what I'd done. When I switched on my phone, I was flooded with notifications. Family members had seen the post, and many offered their support. Some reached out, assuring me they were there if I needed help. It was uplifting, yet that joy faded when I read my parents' angry messages. They demanded I take the post down, filled with hateful words and accusations. My dad even wrote that he wished I felt like I'd never truly existed. The sting of my parents' messages made that painfully clear. My mom's texts echoed the same sentiment, but my sister Amanda's were different. She didn't say much, just that she'd like to talk to me in person if possible. I didn't know how to respond, and the sheer volume of messages overwhelmed me. I set my phone aside and chose silence for the next couple of days. In that time, I blocked my parents. I had no intention of communicating with them again. They were legally obligated to support me until I turned 18, and beyond that, I felt no need to engage with them. My aunt was fine with my decision, and if my dad tried to reach out to her, She didn't let me know. We acted as if nothing had happened, which told me she was on my side and fully supported my choice. That was more than enough for me. For a week, I maintained my distance from my parents, but today, as I was leaving school, they showed up, visibly angry. My friends, aware of the situation, surrounded me like a protective barrier, preventing any unwanted interaction. Still, my parents called out my name, and I knew I had to face them. I approached them and firmly told them I wanted nothing to do with them anymore, but they brushed my words aside and insisted I needed to come home immediately. I was baffled. Why did they suddenly want me back when they'd made it clear I was nothing more than an afterthought? It felt like they were just trying to salvage their reputation with the family, so I demanded to know what had prompted this change. Their anger mixed with desperation as they insisted that my friends shouldn't hear this, so I asked them to step aside for a private conversation. Once we were out of earshot, they explained that they were there to bring me back because I hadn't been responding to their calls or texts. The real kicker? They needed me to come home to secure their inheritance. Apparently, after my post went viral, everyone in the family found out what was going on, including my wealthy paternal grandparents. They threatened my dad, warning that if he didn't reconcile with me and treat me better, I would lose my right to the inheritance, which would instead go to my aunt since she was the one taking care of me. My parents had a decent income, but I understood their desire for financial security. The difference, however, was that I wouldn't pretend they were doing me a favor by wanting me back. They were motivated purely by their own self-interest. Even then, they couldn't muster the common sense to act like they genuinely wanted me back. I simply said I didn't care about their inheritance and walked away, ignoring their calls for me to return. I took the bus back to my aunt's house and recounted everything that happened. She was just as frustrated. To prevent this from happening again, she contacted her lawyer about modifying my custody situation. My parents still had legal rights over me, and that needed to change if I wanted to stay with my aunt. I also called my grandparents to thank them for trying to intervene, but I made it clear I didn't want to return to my parents. After spending a few days with my aunt, I felt a sense of freedom I hadn't experienced before. Living with my parents had been suffocating, and I had clung to the hope that things might improve, but they never did. My grandparents lived out of town, so we didn't see each other often. During family gatherings, my parents always acted like the perfect family, hiding the neglect I endured. While I wasn't treated with outright cruelty, I was often ignored and made to feel unwanted. It seemed fine on the surface, but anyone who spent a few days with me would see how my parents mostly pretended I didn't exist, especially after Amanda's pregnancy, which pushed me further into the background. I told my grandparents all of this, and they reassured me that if living with my aunt was what I wanted, they would ensure it happened. They offered to take care of everything I needed if my parents agreed to sign away their rights. After that conversation, I felt a glimmer of hope. Things were finally looking up for me, but it didn't last long. Just a couple of hours later, I received an email from my dad. It wasn't filled with hatred, but it was disappointing nonetheless. He claimed there was no need for me to make my situation public, insisting that my grandparents would have found out through my aunt anyway. Now, not only were my grandparents upset with them, but they also had to deal with criticism from relatives and were being ostracized, which felt unfair. He mentioned that even some of his co-workers had learned about the situation because my post had gone public and shown up in their feeds. This wasn't good for his image at work, and he believed my actions had stirred unnecessary drama in their lives. So now I had to process the fallout from sharing my story about how my parents asked me to leave my home and move in with my aunt on my 16th birthday because they needed my room for the baby. Update 1. Before I dive into what happened next, I want to thank everyone for taking the time to comment on my post. Your kind words truly mean a lot to me. To address some questions, many of you asked why I hadn't left my parents' house sooner, especially since my aunt and grandparents seemed willing to help. The truth is, I hadn't been treated cruelly. As I mentioned in my original post, I was more often ignored than abused. It was a form of mistreatment, but I convinced myself I was okay since I wasn't facing any physical harm. I had a roof over my head and food to eat, so I thought I was doing just fine and didn't need to feel loved. I didn't recognize the neglect for what it was because it had become my norm. I hesitated to reach out to my family for help, fearing I'd burden them. I worried about what would happen if they refused, especially since my parents cared so much about appearances. I didn't want to make things worse at home. My aunt hadn't offered to take me in earlier, not wanting to insult my parents and unsure if I would even want to live with her. But now, with everything that had unfolded, I felt like it had worked out for the best. While it might have come late, it was still a blessing in disguise. She was now in talks with a lawyer to transfer my custody rights to her, though I knew it would be a challenge to convince my parents to relinquish their rights with the inheritance at stake. But no matter how it played out, I knew my aunt and grandparents would stand by me. Ever since I moved in, my aunt had been incredibly apologetic, realizing just how neglected I had been. Being at home felt different now. I realized how bad I felt for my sister, Amanda, for never reaching out to me about the situation. She had always seemed hesitant, thinking it wasn't her place to intervene, and now I understood why she let it continue. At least the air was clear between me and my family, and I felt a renewed sense of hope for the future. Then there was Amanda. In my original post, I mentioned that she texted me, wanting to meet in person, but I hadn't known how to respond and chose to ignore her message. She had never personally treated me poorly, but she had mirrored our parents' behavior, remaining distant for most of my life. When we did talk, she was usually nice, but the thought of her wanting me out so she could live with her boyfriend and the baby upset me. I didn't want to believe that she would show her true colors. 3 days ago, Amanda reached out again, asking me to visit her. I decided to call her instead to ask why she wanted to see me. I assumed she would be at home, but to my surprise, she told me she was living with her boyfriend and wasn't feeling well enough to go out. She wanted to talk about everything going on with the family, and out of curiosity, I agreed to go see her. When I arrived, she immediately apologized for never standing up for me. She admitted that she knew our parents played favorites and had always celebrated her achievements while overlooking mine. She realized now how messed up that was and wanted things to change. Amanda clarified that she hadn't known anything about our parents' plan to kick me out. She had been shocked when she found out, insisting that she never asked for any of this. Her intention had been to stay with our parents until the baby was a few months old before moving in with her boyfriend. She revealed that she had wanted to move out sooner but had only stayed because our parents insisted. However, after my post, she realized things couldn't continue like this and moved out within a week. That decision led to a big fight with our parents, who accused her of being ungrateful and selfish. But she had never promised them anything. They simply assumed her plans. Ultimately, their drama cost them both of their children. Amanda apologized for being a bad sister, and I forgave her. Holding on to resentment wouldn't help me. We talked things through, and she promised to be there for me from now on, just as my aunt had. It felt nice to have that support. It's been a little less than a week since my original post, and I still haven't heard from my parents since that email. I assumed they had given up on trying to get me back. My grandparents had called me in the meantime to reassure me that my parents wouldn't be bothering me anymore, so I had a strong feeling they had discussed things among themselves. What they talked about, I didn't know, but it was a relief to think my parents had backed off. Update 2. Just 3 days have passed since my last update, and today my aunt shared some incredible news. My parents have agreed to give up their parental rights. The paperwork will be completed soon, and she'll handle all the legal aspects of my custody. I have mixed feelings about this. On one hand, I'm thrilled at the thought of finally having a home where I don't feel unwanted or unneeded. On the other hand, I feel a bit empty and sad about everything I'm leaving behind. It feels strange that this is actually happening, but I know it's for the best. This is what I wanted. Update 3. Hey everyone. A couple of weeks have passed since my aunt officially became my legal guardian. Yay. I also learned that my parents only relinquished my custody because after I told my grandparents I didn't want to go back to living with them, they gave my parents an ultimatum: either lose their entire inheritance or give up my custody and promise not to contact me again, keeping half of what they would have received. We all know what they chose. I'm not surprised at all, and honestly, I don't even care anymore. It feels like I dodged a bullet. Good riddance. I'm still in touch with Amanda, though. My parents are trying to mend things with her before her baby arrives, but she's asked for space and told them to stop bothering her. At this point, I can't help but laugh at the mess they've made of their family. What matters now is that I'm happy with my aunt, and that's all that truly counts.